Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and today we're gonna finally get back to the gearbox, the main shaft for this remote gearbox, and start getting this thing more put together. So stay tuned. Now, like I said, today is remote gearbox part 2. We're gonna get this main shaft assembled. We might even get it into the gearbox, and who knows, we might get the whole kind of front end of the gearbox put together. Before we do, couple things. One is this gearbox build is sponsored by 7 Mini Parts. Every single part that you guys see on this build, sans a few little springs here and there, is brought to you exclusively from 7 Mini Parts. So if you guys are looking to do a gearbox rebuild on your car, check them out. They are a great source for these gearbox parts. Additionally, those few other parts that I got were from a friend of mine over in the UK. I finally got to meet him at IMM, which I'm super excited about, and he gave me this awesome shirt. If you haven't guessed it yet, it is Guessworks, and that would be John Guess at Guessworks. If you're in the UK or if you're in the EU, he's a great source for gearbox stuff. He does ship internationally, and he has all sorts of really hard to find gearbox parts at very reasonable prices. So the last thing I will say before we get into this gearbox is that for a limited time, I am doing free shipping worldwide on all of my keychains. So if you are interested in picking up a hand-stitched, handmade leather keychain to help support the channel and to make your keys look really cool, head to merch.classicminidiy.com. But with that, let's get back into it. Let's jump over to the bench vise and I will show you guys how to finish assembling this main shaft. Now, last time we left off missing a few parts here, and specifically we were missing the detent springs for this little hole, which I have picked up at International Mini Meet. A big thank you to John Guest there. I would not be able to complete this without those springs. So let me get some gloves on and we'll continue this build. Now, if you guys haven't seen, I have part 1 of this remote gearbox build already up and live. You can see that. That might be popping up in the corner, but it's also in the description of this video. And let me go ahead and take this gear back off. And what we need to do is put our little detent spring in here. Now, this side is a single detent spring, so that goes in right there. And then you have a small little post, and that goes in right behind it. And there we have our detent installed. So the next step is to send our gear back down over this shaft here. And if the detent spring is good and new, it might be a little hard to get down there. So what we can do is install our roller bearing again separately, just like that. And then we can send our gear back down over this. Now you can see that little detent post is popping out. And what that's gonna do is allow you to notch in this little retaining clip. So you're gonna wanna put this with the whole side facing up this way. And this is gonna slide over those gears, like so. Now you might be wondering when you're pushing this down, well, wait a minute, this retainer's not going down any, and how do you get that detent spring done? Well, you can see on your little retainer here, you've got a small notch cut out right here. That notch is what's gonna allow you to push that detent plunger while this is coming down on the spring. So you can see here, it's gonna line up, and if you don't knock it out like I did, it should be relatively easy to get down in there. So I've got my little poker, we've got this lined up, and now we push that little sucker in, just like that. And that should go down. Now, that's not the last thing that you need to do. After that goes down, you do need to rotate this. Now listen, just like that. And that is the detent popping back out and locking this retainer in place. Now that gear is held in place and we're ready to flip this main shaft over and continue on the other side. All right, so the next thing that we're gonna install is our synchro hub, but what you need here are new bulk rings. Now these bulk rings are one of the main places that you'll find wear and will cause kind of grindy gear changes, and that is when these bulk rings don't sit quite right on your gear assembly here. So as you can see, that sits down on there, and notice these arrows are pointing upwards. So what you'll do next is allow your synchro hub to slide right down on here, and it'll mate up with these gears here, and then it indexes into the bulk ring. Now, you're gonna wanna add another bulk ring on this side here, just on top. Then we're gonna take our first gear, sleeve, or a speed journal. This is gonna slide down right on this shaft, and it might be a little tight, that's okay. And once that speed journal's in place, you're gonna take another roller bearing, as you can see, mate that down on there. And just like the other ones, I am adding a little lubrication. And then with that, we're gonna slide our first gear down over here. And you'll notice the first gear is gonna come down with the smaller teeth on the bottom. That's what your synchro hub is gonna connect into when you're shifting gears. So now you have a nice solid gear set here ready for use, which is pretty exciting. Now we do need to add a synchro hub on this side as well. Note when I flip this over, you do need to hold those gears in place or they're gonna fall out. We're gonna take our bulk ring, set that down. Arrows should be pointing upwards. And then we're gonna take the big end of our synchro hub, point that upwards as well. And this will come down and that'll meet up just like that. And then one more bulk ring on top with the arrows pointing down. Now, at this stage, we are largely ready to start putting this into the gearbox. So let's jump over to the gearbox and start assembling this. Now, if you haven't done it yet, this is going to be a good time to put your sump filter in. Now, in my case, I'm not going to be doing that because we do have the center oil pickup that's going to be running down and underneath here, which is going to be a little bit different, which I'll show you guys in just a bit. So in my case, I'm not going to be doing that, but in the event that you do use the original sump filter, which personally I would not recommend doing just because, well, if you have it apart, you should really switch it to a center pickup. But if you do, you set the filter down in there right now because it's going to be hard to get it down in there if you don't do that now. Now we can move on to actually putting the main shaft into the gearbox assembly here. Now this is a mostly assembled main shaft. We're only missing our carrier bearing, which is this double roller bearing. I want to talk about that in a minute. And then our final motion shaft, which will come out the side of the gearbox here. So starting with this double roller bearing, it's really important that you get a high quality double roller. Now this one that you see that I'm holding here is an RHP double roller bearing. It's extremely robust, really, really strong. They do have OEM replacement versions that are like not quite as expensive, but they are also not quite as good. I strongly recommend picking up a really high quality bearing. Links to these are in the description below. I put links to both of them depending on your budget, but if you can swing it, definitely spend the extra money to get the nicer bearing. This carries basically the weight of your main shaft as well as all of the power between the main shaft on this side of the gearbox over to your pinion gear that sits over here. Now, on the outer side, you have an outer race. Now, this is a single roller bearing. This is also something you're going to want to get a nice high quality bearing for. That's going to come in on this side over here, but we're not going to cover that just yet. First, we have to put the main shaft in. Now, putting this down in here can be a little awkward, but you just got to kind of feed it around here. Make sure you do your best to keep these gears together, and I'm going to set those right down into the shift fork. And so now your main shaft is installed, well, at least placed. You still need to put your double roller bearing on. Now there's one thing about this double roller bearing. You'll see that there's a small groove around the outside of this. Now if you disassembled your gearbox, you should have a small retaining ring. This ring can come off of the existing double roller and go onto the new one. But if you didn't keep that, maybe it broke, you know, whatever, you can pick this up at 7 Mini Parts. The link to this is in the description as well. All right, and so that is now installed. You can see it sat down into that groove, and this is what's going to help keep the double roller bearing from going too far as you slide it down here. So we're going to slide this onto the main shaft, and you'll find that you can't really push that all the way in, which is good. The next thing that you're going to need to do is hammer that down. Now, this is a really, really important part. It's very easy to damage that double roller. I actually damaged the double roller that I bought initially for this gearbox. My punch slipped past the race, fell down into the balls, and then completely destroyed the plastic race in there. So take your time. Hammer this down in here, and you're going to want to get it as close to flush on this side as you can. So let me bring you guys to the front of the gearbox. Now you can see my double roller bearing is all the way installed. The way that you can tell that, and it might be hard to see on the camera, but right up in here there is a small break in the actual retaining ring, and you can see that your retaining ring is all the way set down on the ridge, the kind of retainer that's built into your gearbox. So with that installed, now we can flip the gearbox and go to the other side. All right, so the next step is to install our final motion shaft, which is this right here. There is a small needle roller inside here, and they're different sizes depending on the type of gearbox you have. So make sure, in this case, this is a 4-synchro gearbox with a 4-synchro main shaft, and it needs the smaller needle roller inside here. Also, don't forget your bulk ring in case it's fallen out. Oh, whoops. Oh gosh, I'm always leaving this everywhere. Need to get that out of here. So we're going to reinstall our bulk ring back into its synchro hub, and then we're going to put our final motion shaft in here. And then of course our actual bearing. This has a ridge built into it, so there's no worry about it going too far. One thing you are going to want to take care to do is really clean up this retainer here. You don't want any debris in the way because it'll prevent the lock ring from going down into its seating place and holding this in place. Now this one's a little funny. You're going to want to take your time getting this down onto its mating face.
On the first day of the year, Dudley Pippin came to live in the city. He said to his mother, "Nobody knows me here. I don't have..."
Now sometimes when installing this, you will find that the main shaft down here, this double roller bearing, will kind of move a little bit. So when you're done on this side, you're going to want to come back and double check your double roller bearing. So the next step is to get your retaining ring. This goes on out here. You are going to need a set of channel locks in order to pull this together so that you can retain it down here. So we're going to set this down here, kind of set that down into place, and it might need a little bit of coaxing. All right, so this next part is can be a little bit frustrating, but what we're going to be doing next is installing our lay shaft and our lay gear. Now this lay gear has needle rollers inside it, and they're different depending on the lay gear that you have. So this is an earlier 4-synchro lay gear, so it has a specific needle roller that goes in the end here, and then 2 of the same size needle rollers sit in the back end here, right down inside. So you can see I've already added some assembly lubricant to the I like those to be pre-lubricated. Although this is all going to end up sitting in oil, it's just going to be a lot better off if it's all lubricated already, so that the first initial startup, nothing is, no unnecessary wear is put on it. Now on this box you have 2 thrust washers. These thrust washers, a small one sits right here, and then this large one sits on the other side of the case down here in this hole. Now these provide thrust to your lay gear, which sits in between them. However, a lot of times these come out of clearance. So basically the space in between this and the end of your lay gear, there's too much of a gap there. So you have to get a thrust washer that either takes up that slack, or you can use shims, which is the preferred method at this point in time because these are getting really hard to find. So the easiest thing to do is to get shims that go on the back side of these and allow you to bump them out and provide you the necessary amount of clearance. Now, I've already verified that the clearance is correct on this, but basically what you do in order to do that is you take a feeler gauge and you put it in between the thrust washer and the end of your lay gear here. But like I said, that has already been done on this box. So to make this job a little easier, I take a little bit of assembly lube and I put it on the back side of my thrust washer here. And now what this is going to do is allow me to stick it, literally stick it to the box here, but obviously it's not glue, it just kind of holds it in place a little bit. It's not perfect, but then what we're going to do is take our lay gear with the roller bearings inside it, our lay shaft, which you should replace when you have the box apart like this, and of course our brand new center pickup. Now all 3 of these, well, I guess 2 of these need to go in at about the same time. It can be a little awkward, and I'm gonna show you this the best I can. However, as you can see, it's not super easy for me to show you how all this looks.
Friend, I have to tell everybody about myself.
In a little while, Dudley saw the girl next door.
Boom. And there we go. The lay gear is in and our center pickup is just loose in here. Now we take our lay shaft, make sure it is nice and clean. This is something that you're going to want to replace when you're doing this job. This is an older style stepped lay shaft. These can be upgraded on these older boxes if you want to. You can drill out some of the casing and make a single one solid lay shaft that fits inside here. Personally, I'm not doing it on this build because it's not a lot of power and it should be just fine with the single lay gear here. But again, I'm going to lube it up. This is something that I do. Not everybody does this. And then you slide this in here. And it should go in without any sort of fuss. Note on the end here, this thrust washer might need to be lined up with your pinky to allow that to pass through. And so now we have a Laygear installed. Pretty exciting stuff. Now I am going to leave this loose for right now just in case I run into any snags, but for right now let's turn this around and look at this side here where we're going to go ahead and install the pinion gear, the retainer for that pinion, and shim this out so that it's nice and within clearance. Now this next step is about installing a shim. Looks just like this. Granted, the one you're going to want to install is not bent like this. This was installed improperly when I was taking this apart, so whoever did this before me did not do this correctly. So the way that this works is you have a little retainer here, and let me go ahead and stick this in here, and then I will show you guys how all of this comes together. Okay, so now you can see the way that this works is that you have this little retainer here. And if we push that out just a little bit like that, your shim is going to go in underneath, under this little tab here. So just like that. And what you need to have here is zero clearance. You don't want any clearance in this thing. So any sort of play inside this retainer is too much play. So let's go ahead and slide in our retainer here. Just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and put the bolts in. Now this is an old style retainer. Later models ended up doing away with one of the bolt holes that was just not necessary and created a fracture point. But as long as you're careful, you're going to be okay. Great news, this retainer has no clearance issues, which is great. So all that's left is to go ahead and knock down these lock tabs, get these locked into place, and then we can start assembling our shift linkage, which is pretty exciting. Now, there's actually one more thing that we have to do after we've locked down those tabs, and that is to install your pinion gear. Now this pinion gear can go either way, and this is a two-piece system, so this is paired with a final drive gear, the piece that sits on your actual differential. And if you want to replace the final drive gear in a car, this gear plus the differential gear need to be changed together. And you can figure out your final drive by counting the teeth on this gear and the other and doing a little bit of math. However, I have a 3.44 gear ratio here. It's going to be perfect for the 998 round town. It's not going to be, you know, a crazy race car or anything, but it is going to be it'll be good for this. And then the last piece that goes on is your pinion nut. Now this nut gets torqued down to a crazy foot poundage. The easiest way to do this is either with an actual impact wrench, like an impact gun, or by flipping the whole gearbox upside down and basically standing on it and torquing the sucker down. This is an extremely important gear because all the power that's going through your gearbox here is getting delivered to your final drive gear that sits right in here, and your differential comes off the backside. All that power gets delivered through that gear, so it's really important that this is torqued down properly. Otherwise, you can have some pretty crazy catastrophic issues happen with your gearbox, which I imagine most of you would not want to participate in. Now, one thing you're probably noticing is that all the gears are moving now, so I'm not able to tighten this down anymore because the gears are moving. And in order to fix that, what we have to do is engage two gears at the same time. So we're going to engage this one like that. So you can see that went into gear. And then, so now you can see I have this synchronizer moved out, this synchronizer moved out, and what that does is engages two gears at the same time, which is going to prevent this whole assembly from turning while I tighten this down. All right, I'm going to take my gun and I'm going to go ahead and tighten this sucker down as tight as I can get it, and then I'm going to check the torque with my torque wrench. Okay, so this next part involves putting this little shift selector here. This moves up and down. This needs to go onto your selector shaft here. Now, keep in mind that on the back side of your gearbox here, right on the back side over here, you are gonna need a small rubber seal. I'm not gonna show you guys that because it's pretty straightforward, but don't forget to put that rubber seal on or you're gonna leak oil. So after you've got that rubber seal in, now all you do is take this selector shaft. You can see it's got a small notch on it and a keyway. And now this is going to slide through this hole and down into this hole down here, which ultimately is going to have a detent in it. But for right now, it's free. And you'll see this little selector here has a notch in the bottom. The keyway actually runs into the bottom notch. Now you can see the selector is going to move up and down in here, and there's a small notch in that shaft. And that small hole is right where this screw goes through. Just like that. You can see this gear selector can move through this gate now, which is pretty cool stuff. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is move this case back a little bit, and you'll see this front hole here. And that is where your final detent spring goes in. And then don't forget there's a fiber washer that goes on this. Now some cars have just a big screw or a big bolt that goes in here. On this box, what this is a reverse switch. So when your gear is pushed down into the gate where a reverse would be, it makes a connection and can be used to operate your reverse lights on the back of your car, which is pretty cool. It's an interesting way to make that whole system work. But tighten that down. So now all that's left is to assemble the right side of your gearbox back here, and then we'll be able to move on to the back side. We obviously need to connect up our oil catch here. I'm gonna leave that out still because there's a plate on the back. I'm just not ready to connect that up yet. But we can get this side reassembled with our gate protector here, is what I call it. I don't know if that's actually what it's called. And then we'll be ready to roll. Now this next part is a good way to see some of the ways that the remote gearbox is different. So you have this little unit here, and this helps kind of keep the gate straight. I don't really know a better way to explain that. And so now you can see this gate, this little retainer here helps actually kind of hold this all together as it moves up and down the gate, and pretty straightforward, I think. And then you have a big gasket that goes around the outside here, and as you guys know, I really like gasket sealer, especially for things like this where there's a ton of oil on the other side of this gearbox. So this is actually a really great time for you guys to see. This gasket is cut the same no matter which gearbox this is going on to, but you can see why there's a big face right here, because this little retainer used to be in your gearbox. It used to have a face to clamp down onto. Pretty interesting stuff, but that is why that is cut that way. Now that we've test fit everything, it's time to go ahead, put this gasket sealer on here and tighten this sucker up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm gonna wrap this episode up. I think it's a little bit shorter than the last portion of the gearbox rebuild, but I got a good bit of stuff done on this episode, and I don't wanna overload information. So I am gonna be continuing on with this. You might have noticed a few bolts were left off of this Speedo housing over here. Those bolts will need to be ordered. I completely forgot those, but no worries. That's making a nice seal with the bolts that are in there. The next episode, we should be able to wrap up the majority of the gearbox. I think we're gonna be able to cover the differential, and we might actually be able to cover the drop gears and all that stuff over here. And then that will be basically it for this remote gearbox rebuild. And then we can finally mate it back to the early 998, and then that can go to someone who needs it, which is exciting stuff. But a huge, huge thank you to 7 Mini Parts for providing 99% of the parts on this build. Also, a huge shout out to Guessworks. He's helped me out a lot. John Guess over in the UK with some of the really, really hard to find parts. And I'm super thankful. So John, if you're watching this, thank you very much. But I hope you guys have found this interesting so far. If you have any questions about this, or you have any pointers, things that I might have missed, I don't think I did on this episode, but if I did, let me know, and I'll pin your comment on the bottom so that people don't, miss those when they're working on their gearbox. I do want to say, if you like this kind of content, if you want to see more videos like this or big rebuild videos, consider supporting me on patreon.com. It really helps me out, and it helps cover the parts that I need to show you guys these big projects. But the link to that is in the description of my video, and aside from that, that's it for this episode. So enjoy those minis and motor on.